The German Chancellor says that the group of 7 major economies have agreed to keep in place anti-Russia sanctions over the crisis in Ukraine. Angela Merkel said that Russia needs to implement the Minsk truce deal for sanctions to be lifted. Merkel made the statements at the end of a 2-day G7 summit in Germany. She added that the group consensually condemns what she called Russia's annexation of Crimea. But she said the crisis in Ukraine can only be solved in a political way. The U.S. and the European Union have slapped several rounds of sanctions on Moscow over the crisis in Ukraine. The Minsk truce has failed to end the violence in eastern Ukraine. Kiev and pro-Russians blame each other for violating the ceasefire. Marcus Papadopoulos is editor of Politics First, joining us from London. Marcus Papadopoulos, so looking at Russia being excluded from the G7, I'm not too sure if this is indefinitely, but things look that way. Is this stance by the G7 a united stance? Before it used to be that there was some extremes, like perhaps Germany might be succumbing to get close to Germany. We noticed with the talks that happened with France, but now it doesn't seem that way anymore.
Well, I don't think there were any surprises stemming from the G7 summit in regard to the Ukraine crisis. It was very clear that the G7 summit would conclude that Russia is the guilty party in the Ukraine conflict, and that is why the sanctions have to remain in place. And if there's further breaches of the Minsk II peace agreements, then there'll be further sanctions. It's an intolerable world that we live in, whereby the leaders, Western leaders, are able to make those accusations against, in this case, Russia, when it's actually their actions which have caused the conflict in Ukraine. And I think that certainly it's the case that America and Britain would have been at the forefront at the G7 summit in making the case for sanctions to remain in place against Russia and for further sanctions against Russia should, in the view of America and Britain and the G7 as a whole, be a further deterioration in the situation in Ukraine. So no surprises from the G7 summit. Of course, the irony is that principally America is the root cause of the terrible conflict in Ukraine.
You know, I can't help but think about the ex-U.S. Treasury Secretary, Timothy Geithner, going to China and saying, China, why don't you sanction your own oil supply? Don't buy from Iran, so we could keep sanctions in place. Is that the type of regime that the U.S. wants to implement with the rest of the G7 members when it comes to Russia?
Oh, without a doubt. Even since the collapse of the Cold War, America has been attempting to weaken Russia in Europe and thereby in the world by encircling Russia on its western borders with NATO member states. And of course, America has been backed up by that in that attempt once again by Britain. And in regard to the rest of the G7's countries, with the notable exception of Japan, I think we can say quite convincingly that the other countries there, for example, France, Italy and Germany, will support America in its position on Russia over Ukraine. Now, there's talk about Germany not being entirely comfortable with the sanctions against Russia. Well, that is true to an extent, but when push comes to shove, strategic allies stick together, and Germany is a staunch strategic ally of America, and Germany will go along with what America dictates.
Marcus Papadopoulos, editor of Politics First, thank you so much.